Hello everyone, welcome to this next aspConf talk, a glimpse into asp.NET. Take an ever-seen look inside your server using Glimpse. And this is a talk, and my name is Anthony Vanderhorn, and I'm a web developer based in Brisbane, Australia. And my co-host
is Nick Molnar. I am based in New York City. I've been a web developer for about 15 years and love ASP.NET and ASP.NET MVC, so we're really excited to show you what we've been working on in the last year with our open source project Glimpse.
So essentially what we're going to do is cover a little bit of what Glimpse is, the problem space we're trying to deal with, a brief history about Glimpse, how you can go through installing plugins and all that sort of stuff, deep dive into some of the plugins, okay, getting into the real nitty-gritty of how can we introspect into routing, and how can you see, what exact timings are occurring within your system. Then we'll have a little bit of an overview of the architecture and how it's all put together, and then a brief chat on the history, and then how you can get involved. So in terms of what Glimpse is, I guess the best way of describing it is, until now, debugging has been a science and an art, and it's been fundamentally broken. Debugging has been around in its current form for like over 20 years, and Glimpse really tries to take a look at that and see how we can turn it on its head and really change how we see debugging. Glimpse allows you to take a never-before seen look inside your server, and instead of forcing you to go line by line through your code, Glimpse does all of that work for you. It's able to tell you exactly what's going on within each request. It's able to summarize all of that data together in a way that facilitates easy understanding. And it's a tool that lets you follow your code and combines all of that data together in a 10,000 foot view, right down to like the 5-foot view of your code. Meaning we can show you everything that's happened in like a one-page summary within your site, right down to what's happening in an individual segment of your application, like routing, and then all the way down to individual methods that might be being called. If something on your server is running too slow or inefficiently or is buggy, Glimpse can help you find where it is. We have been operating under the false pretense that debugging is supposed to be hard, and it's always seemed to be clunky and awkward, and this is why we've kind of come to the conclusion that Glimpse is a tool that can really help you there. So to give you a little bit of a history of how it came about, these topics were what myself and Nick were discussing one night on a subway station in New York, and we're talking about how difficult it was to try and get that summary, that aggregate view of what's going on with a particular request. We're also talking about how with where we were working, we found it really difficult to try and convey some of these convention over configuration concepts of MVC and of other like frameworks, and there's nothing that really can tell you when they go wrong how they went wrong. And looking at like the ongoing monitoring of your website, trying to figure out, just as I'm in development mode, whereabouts, when I come across a slow page, what was that? What caused that page to be slow that I just went past? So we decided that it was a cool idea, and we started working on it. And shortly after that, we heard that at Mix 11, they were going to have an open source fest that John Popper was running. And we decided, what the hell, we didn't have very much at that time. I don't even know if we had one line of code at that stage. But we thought, we had a cool idea, let's submit it. And we created our GitHub repository, submitted our application off to the Open Source Fest. And about a week later, with 5 weeks left to go to the conference, we found out that Glimpse was accepted. As anyone would do at that time, Nick and myself went into panic mode, and we had 5 weeks to create what we demoed at Mix. And at that time, it was really something that people had never seen before, and is something that people realized that was sorely being missed. And from that stage, we've continued working on Glimpse in the open source spirit. We've had lots of contributions from the community, and Glimpse has gone in directions and continues to go in directions that, only gives me hope that we'll be able to do more and more going into the future.
So with that, let's go ahead and dive into a demo and see what Glimpse really is. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to download and install Glimpse into your project. Of course, you can go to our website, getglimpse.com, and you'll find all the information you ever wanted to know, the documentation, our blog to follow the news. But to get the actual bit, we give you two options. You can either download it from glimpse.codeplex.com, and this is for those of you who are maybe using an older version of Visual Studio, or you would leverage NuGet. NuGet is really the best way to get and install Glimpse, and we'll show you how to do that really quickly. NuGet has been around for about a little over a year now, so it's really kind of changed the way that we do development, particularly with open source libraries in the .NET universe. So to begin, let's go ahead and take a look at the Music Store Sample MVC application. The tutorial for building this application can be found on the asp.net website. And we're going to go ahead and fire up this application. Just doing a little F5 to build it. Hamster wheels spin. Okay, and so here we go. We have the Music Store application. You can see that this is the out-of-the-box application that you would get from the asp.net website. We have made one modification to this section right here of the application. We've put in a small news ticker that flips through music news every 10 seconds, just to show off some of the Ajax functionality in Glimpse. We'll talk about that a little later. So once we have an application up and running, we'll switch back to Visual Studio. To add Glimpse, we simply need to add a NuGet dependency. So you can right-click on your project, go Manage NuGet Packages, and from our online feed, we're going to do a search for Glimpse. Now right away you'll notice that there's multiple Glimpse packages, and we'll talk about what all of these different packages mean and where they come from in the future. But since Music Store is an MVC3 application, we're going to install the glimpse.mvc3 package. So let me go ahead and install that. And in addition, while we're here, I'm also going to install Glimpse for EF, for Entity Framework. So we will install that, and you'll see pretty painless install. Now we're done. Close. Glimpse will automatically open up some README files for you, so you can read getting started. But since you're watching us now, I think we'll walk you through it. Let me show you what the NuGet has done. This is a demo that you all have probably seen before, but we've added in a couple of assemblies, one for MVC, the core, and then the one for EF, since we installed the EF package. And in addition, our web config has been modified to have a section for Glimpse. You can see this section has been added with the Glimpse configuration settings, as well as HTTP module and an HTTP handler. So now we're going to go ahead and rerun the application, just hitting F5 again. And our application starts up. And what you'll see is really nothing different from what we had before. But now, in the URL bar, we can go to /glimpse.axd. And this is kind of our main entry configuration page. And what will pop up gives you options for turning Glimpse on and off, as well as seeing what your settings are for some of our various configuration that we'll get into later. So I'm simply going to turn Glimpse on. I'm going to go back to the home page of my application. And once again, we'll see that we have the standard MVC Music Store. But now what you'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is our little Glimpse logo pops up as a little div. This is actually a div. This is actually HTML that's being overlaid on top of your website. This is not a browser plugin. And when I click on that div, we see the Glimpse UI pop up. It looks very similar to Firebug or other F12 debugging tools that you might be used to in your browser. Each of the tabs in Glimpse offers another look into a different concern on your server. So just like the tabs in Firebug would give you information about CSS or JavaScript, the tabs in Glimpse give you information about routing or views or model binding or the different concerns that you would have on the server side of your application. Our most popular tab is the Routes tab, and what you'll see here is we show all of the routes that have been configured in the application, whether or not they matched for the given request in my browser. So for localhost colon 3333.3, you can see that the route that matched was controller/action/ID, and we give you information about that route. So the placeholder controller has a default value of home, and for this request, we actually use the default value of home. We use all the default values because you can see the default value and the actual value matched. Let me browse to another part of my application. So I'm going to go to the rock genre of the music store. And when I do that, now you'll see that once again we match controller/action/ID, but we did not use the default values. We used the store controller and the browse action instead of home and index. So in addition to routes, we also will show constraints. As you can see here, we're filtering out favicon requests, as well as any data tokens that have been passed through. Data tokens get used specifically when you're using areas in MVC, but you may also have reason to add data tokens to your routes. So in addition to routes, views is another popular tab. Views shows all requests to any of the configured view engines that you have in your application and whether or not the view was found. So in this example, we're looking for a view named Browse. It is not a partial view, and so we ask the web form view engine that we have configured to check in the cache, and that view was not found. So then MVC moves on to the Razor view engine to check in the cache for the Browse view, and in Razor's cache, the view was not found. So once again, we go back to the web form view engine, asking for it to not check the cache, and instead it will check the disk. And you can see here, Glimpse will show you all of the directories on the disk where the Browse view is searched for, and the file is not found. So finally we go back to Razor, not checking the cache, and we do get a match, and we get the view back. So you can see that Glimpse here highlights this match in yellow. We can also see a bit of information about the model. So we can see the model type was a genre that has been passed into Browse, and we can see the values that were passed into by that model, as well as the temporary data. So lots of information about our view is passed in. It's very interesting because from a high level, what you'll see is every time we do a match, like on these partial views, cart summary and genre menu, it's always from the Razor view engine. That's because the MVC Music Store does not use the web form view engine. It only uses the Razor view engine. And so it might be a best practice, or a good idea at the very least, to remove the web form view engine from your application so we're not doing unnecessary checks moving forward. So this is great. Now we have routes, and so we understand how a particular action is being executed. We understand the views for when that action returns a view. But let's look at the actual actions. So if we go to execution, what we can see is we can see a list of all of the methods that ran in the MVC pipeline. This can be actually quite difficult to figure out because there's been changes in the way that this pipeline runs between the various versions of MVC, and in addition, execution might be very dynamic based on things that you may have in your view or using a child action. So in this case, you can see here that we're running, the very first thing we run is an authorization filter, followed by an action filter. Finally, we run the browse method on the store controller. We have another action and result filter, followed by the execute result on the view result, etc., etc., etc. We can see the entire pipeline and the order in which our filters and our views and our child actions are all rendered, along with timing information and additional information to help us figure out how to sort or change the order of execution. Another challenging thing to debug in MVC is model binding. So what we're going to do here, let me move Glimpse down a little bit. We're going to go to admin, and I'm going to try to log in. I'm going to put in junk username and password, and we will go ahead and try to log on. What you'll see is, of course, we weren't able to log in because it's an invalid username and password. But that doesn't mean that there was not a model binding operation happening from this form post back into my controller action. And if we take a look at what Glimpse shows us on the binding tab, you'll see a play-by-play of how MVC tried to bind the individual properties. So there's a parameter on the action called model. It is of type logon model, and MVC checked the child action value provider, the form value provider, the route data value provider, the query string value provider, and the HTTP file collection value provider, and it was unsuccessful to match anything called model. So instead, we moved into matching individual properties on the login model. So first was username, followed by password, followed by remember me, and we can see that for each one of them, the form value provider successfully returned values. And we can see what those values look like as the attempted value and as the raw value, as well as which culture is being used to parse out those values. You'll note that there's also a return URL parameter on our action method, and English United States, which is the culture ENUS that I run my browser under, was used to parse everything that came from the form. However, MVC uses an invariant language and an invariant country when parsing anything from the URL. So you can see that the return URL was matched by the query string value provider, and you can see why up here in our URL, because we had a query string parameter called return URL that matched, and it was /store manager, and then you can see Glimpse will show us that our binding of /store manager was passed through. So binding is quite handy to make sure that we understand why values are being passed through, particularly when we have things like name collisions or complex binding, maybe using square bracket syntax or something like that for collections. So one of the questions that we get very often about Glimpse is, well, why wouldn't I just use Fiddler? Doesn't Fiddler show me some of this information? And it's important to understand that Glimpse and Fiddler are complementary tools, as well as F12 debugging tools in your browser, but they serve different purposes. And I think the reason why people get confused and feel like Glimpse and Fiddler overlap is because they're looking at the Request tab. And the Request tab shows you a lot of the same information that you would have been able to see from Fiddler. What some of the form values that got passed over in the request were, your query string parameters, your culture, any cookies that you have set. You can see here that we have a whole bunch of cookies, including one that's a JSON value that we show off. But there's a difference between the Request tab and something like Firebug, the request information we see in Fiddler, and the request information that we see in Glimpse. In the browser tools, the browser is showing the request as it was sent from the user's machine. Fiddler is showing the request as it was seen on the wire, and Glimpse is showing the request as it was received at the server. The reason why we want to see these is so we can do comparisons, particularly when we have nasty problems with a proxy that might be in the middle and changing a request ever so slightly. We'll be able to compare what was sent from the client and what was received by the server with the Request tab. So there's lots of interesting information in the Request tab, but it's all fairly standard web development paths and input parameters, stuff like that. So finally, we'll take a look at the Trace tab. Now, Trace does exactly what you would think it would. It spits out any messages that were traced during the execution of a given request. So you'll see here on the home page, we add some information for what's happening in the background of the framework, so some of the stuff that the dependency resolver is doing, as well as we have the ability to add in our own custom trace messages. Let me show you how we do that real quick. So the first thing to note, and we'll go into our home controller. Let me stop the debugger. and we can simply use system.diagnostics.trace. So you saw before we had to get top 5 albums right here, and that's not using any Glimpse specific code, and you can do that. That's actually the way that we recommend that you interact with that feature of Glimpse. In addition, you can also call Glimpse trace. You have to add a reference to our assembly once you have it installed, and Glimpse timer, which does timing, which we'll look at in a moment. Let me save that, and we'll run these changes. Alright, and here comes the web server booting up. And now you'll see I have much more rich information. I have the ability to do failures and warnings and errors, and we can style them a little bit and add some color and information. So Glimpse does its best to always tap into the abilities that are built into the .NET framework, because one of the design principles that we have with Glimpse is that you should not have to change anything in your application, only configuration, to get Glimpse up and running. And then we have optional places where if you want to change code to provide extra information to Glimpse, you can, but there's always a way of doing it without taking any further dependency on Glimpse. You can just add and remove the NuGet package as you see fit. So that covers it for the tabs that I'm going to cover with you today. I'm going to hand it over to Anthony, who's going to cover a few of the remaining tabs that we have left.
Okay, so essentially the next one we're going to take a quick look at is the config tab. Now, this isn't one of those ones that I'd imagine you use all the time, but it can be really, really useful when certain weird things might happen within your website. So imagine you're in a web farm scenario and different requests are doing different things and you can't figure out what's going on. So what you could do is have a look at the web config and to be able to determine, well, is one config on one server different to another config on another server? So what we do is we expose the config information, and that doesn't even have to be in a web farm scenario. It might be a difference between, you know, what you've got in dev or in test versus production or whatever else. So we expose what we think is the most common things out of the web config that one would want to see. Another really interesting tab, which again goes down the route of or the route of looking at the environment that you're operating in, is the environment tab. And in this tab, we actually show you a lot of what's going on here. So if we have a look, we can see the machine name, okay, that we're actually hitting, okay, which in this case is our laptop. And then we can see that we've got which operating system we're running under and when it was last restarted, you know, and what time zone that was in, which is really important. We can also see what web server, we can see what version of the .NET framework we're operating with, and whether we're in debug. Okay, now again, I think that's a really important one, because sometimes if you're doing remote debugging to a production server, you get scenarios where you might have accidentally left the debugger connected. Then we can also see what culture the server is set to, which is really important. I don't know how many times I've been bitten by cultural differences between what the client is sending through versus what I get, which is really important in MVC when we're looking at like model binding and what comes through the post versus the get and how all that's treated. We can also see what our current trust level is, which is always a pain in the bum, trying to work out what exact trust level am I operating in a given environment. We can see the worker process, we can see when that process was restarted, and then we can get some really useful time zone information. The time zone stuff, again, is particularly pertinent with like daylight savings, okay, and trying to work out what time zones you're working in and all that sort of stuff. Finally, on this tab, we try to show you what application-specific DLLs you're running and what system DLLs are actually running. So here, we can actually see we've got some EF stuff, we've got some dynamic proxy stuff. That's just got to do with the setup. But in itself, we can see that, you know, for instance, for Glimpse EF, we're running 0.87. okay? And imagine you're hitting 2 different web servers and you're using Log4Net, and you found out that there was some problems going on in your logging, and it was because you're running one version of Log4Net on one server and you're using a different version of Log4Net in another server. This can really easily surface that, or it can be really difficult to actually find that when it's buried down, or you have to start looking at individual DLLs or anything like that. The next tab we'll talk about is the timeline tab, and this is probably one that I think doesn't get enough notice, but one that we're quite proud of and what it's showing. So here we can basically see a list of the key events that are happening within the system. So if we have a look at the top, we can see we've got ASP.NET, we've got filter, we've got view, and we've got controller. And we've got some others if we scroll down there. Now, essentially, what we're seeing in the top there is a summarized view of what's happening in the events below. And as you can see, like the views kind of wrapping up all the view timings into one bar if they all happen at the same time, etc. But in the below view, we can actually see the breakdown of all of these different timing events and where they fit in, when they occurred, and all that sort of stuff. We can also zoom into this timeline. You'll notice that we have these little handles up here, and we can actually say, well, what was happening between, roughly the 2-second mark to the 4-second mark, okay? And that's actually gripped the timeline and ripped it open, like spread it apart and zoomed in. So we can actually get a better breakdown of what's actually going on in that part of the timeline. We can also, using the up at the category, filter out certain events. So let's say we don't want to see the view information, we can untick that, and all of a sudden we're left with only the main events. We can also fundamentally switch the view of this data. So not all the time is viewing it as a timeline useful, but overall the information is extremely useful. So we can switch to this view, which shows us a more hierarchical view of our data, shows us the starting point, the durations, and the durations without children. And you can also see that we'd still try and give you a little bit of a graphical representation of where those various events fit in relation to each other. You can also add your own custom timing events to this. Probably won't go into detail with it here because we'll run out of time, but it's very, very easy to do, and it's something that you can easily do to try and get your events in there and get your custom timings running within the system and surfacing those. The next thing that we'll take a look at is the SQL tab. So switching over to this is one thing that we found, that when we wanted to start showing what was going on in the server, SQL commands are usually something that's pretty important to show. And so we've created this prototype that we're running at the moment. This is likely to change in time. But here we can actually see what's going on. Now, the reason why we've got a few different commands operating in this particular view that you're looking at is because this is the first time it's tried to do this authentication request, and built into ASP.NET, where it's trying to do some authentication things behind the scenes in terms of setting up the auth database and whatever else, hence all of the connections. But if we navigate to another page, we should see that list of connections reduces somewhat. So we'll just wait for that to load. Now, what we actually try and do here is group everything that we're seeing by connection. Okay, so we can see how many commands do we have per connection. So at the moment you can see each one of these boxes that you're seeing represents one connection, and we can see the time that connection was open for. Okay, so we had 3 separate connections, each which had one command. Now instantly from this we could ascertain that we want to use one connection. Instead of opening up 3 separate connections to the database, we want to trunk all these together and use that one connection. trying to determine that was what was happening if you're not used to the code base, or if you've got a complex page, is extremely difficult to do currently. So also here we can open up the SQL that was actually generated for a given link query. So from here we can actually see there was one parameter, for instance, in this complex query that link actually generated for us, and we can actually see what its type, what its value was, and we can actually see that in the SQL command itself. Okay, so what we've tried to do is make it so that you can just copy and paste this individual SQL command into SQL Server, so that you can, or into SQL Management Studio, so that you can actually get access to that. We also show you how many records were returned by this given query, how long that command took to execute, and likewise from first, if we had multiple commands that were operating within this connection, how that would, where each command happened in terms of how long that connection was actually open for. Now, if we actually navigate to the home page, the next big one that we're going to show you is the Ajax tab. Now, one thing we realized very quickly when we were developing Glimpse was that more and more websites are becoming richer and richer, even to the point where we have single page apps, and that you're going to have SQL commands that are executed during the lifetime of your app, and that these Ajax requests are just other queries to the server, the fully fledged HTTP requests. And because of that, each one is going to have their own timing information, their own routes that they connected to, essentially their own Glimpse requests data. So all of what you're seeing here, they will have on the top. So we're actually collecting this, and what we're doing is if we select one of these Ajax requests that's happened in the past and actually launch that, you'll see the context of Glimpse just switched. So in the title, okay, you can see that now we're viewing our Ajax, okay, or an Ajax request, and the URL that it hit was home/news. Now, to prove that we're actually looking at the Glimpse data for that individual request, if we switch over to like the routes tab, for instance, okay, we can actually see that if we scroll down, that the routes values that were matched were home and news. Previously, that would have said home and index, okay, because we were looking at that particular page. But now we're actually looking at home and news. And so if we switch back to Ajax, you'll see that because this is a poll that's going out every 10 seconds, the list will continue to build up here, okay? But essentially, we can view any particular one that we want, and we can even clear the list. We can reset back to our starting page, okay, that we're actually on, which we might do now. And now we're looking back at our home context. Another really cool feature that we found, that we discovered when we were looking at this, if we switch to, let's say, classical music now, is that if we're doing, let's say, mobile development, okay? I remember when Nick and I were at Mix and we were talking about, well, what would we do? Would we come up with like a cool responsive UI that, could fit on a mobile device or something like this? And, the Glimpse UI would compact down and that sort of stuff. And we just realized that that wasn't going to happen. So how do we provide this information for people that were doing like mobile development or any sort of remote development like that? And so we decided that, well, the server knows about these previous requests. With the technology that we put into, or the methods that we used for the Ajax tab, the server has to remember these previous requests that were going on. So what we were able to do is use that same memory store, okay, to actually be able to tell you, here's a mobile device that's navigating around, okay, and let's see what requests are happening there. Now, all of this happens within the remote tab, okay, and what we can actually see is a list of the various, in quotes, sessions that are currently in effect. So what we're seeing is the last 15 requests that Glimpse knows about. So if we actually launch this, we'll actually get a list in the left-hand side of the client. So if we click the launch button, which I'll just go over to do, there we go, we can actually see a list of those last 15 requests. Now, the reason why it says the client was null, okay, is because that's the one we're currently on. It doesn't have a name set. That's the default, okay? But then we can see that the get methods, we can see the URLs that they were hitting, and we can see what type of browser, when they occurred, whether they were Ajax, all that sort of stuff. And likewise, we can go in and click the launch button, okay, for any one of these, okay, and this time we can see the context switches to remote, okay. We can see the URL that we're on, and again, if we go to the routes tab and have a look at the routing information that was selected, we can see, right, store was selected and browse was selected as our, place within our placeholders within that default route. Going back to the remote tab, as you can see, all we've done so far is just see the previous requests that we actually made. But what happens if we opened up another browser window? Okay, so in this case, to try and simulate, okay, a mobile device, we're going to open up Chrome, okay, and we're going to pretend that Chrome is our remote iPhone. So if we go to glimpse/glimpse.axt, you'll see that before Nick clicked on turn on Glimpse button, but now we're actually going to click on the set session name. And in this case, we're going to set the session name to iPhone, simulating that this is an iPhone, and then we're going to go back to the home page, and we're going to have a look at how the underlying window responds as we navigate around the website. Again, trying to simulate what's going on here. So if we make the browser, this new browser window smaller, we should see that underneath, which I think we can, that iPhone has popped up in the list. Okay, now its number is already up a few because of the paging, or the polling, sorry, that was happening on the underneath page. But if we now launch for iPhone on the background, we'll actually be able to see all of those requests. Now, if we switch back to our iPhone, and we do a little bit more navigating, okay, we'll actually see more things coming into that list. Okay, so as you can see, it's kind of a powerful way of showing, showing the Glimpse data for remote sessions that are going on. And if we actually click the launch tab, one of those, we'll actually be able to see that context switch has shifted. We're still in remote, but now we're looking at iPhone. We're looking at the Latin store, and if we go to back to the routes, we'll actually see that that's all connected through, and now we're looking at the Glimpse data for that one. So that covers all the major tabs that we're going to talk about, at least in this scenario. And I'll hand it back over to Nick to talk a little bit about how Glimpse is actually doing what it's doing.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. So no good technical talk is complete without an architecture diagram. So we have a very pretty one here. So our architecture diagram kind of shows the way that Glimpse is put together. From day one, we've always wanted to separate the Glimpse client, which is the JavaScript UI that we've been demoing for the last several minutes, and the Glimpse server, which is the bits that NuGet installs and runs within your application. So essentially what we've done is we've separated out the core of Glimpse, which you see circled here in the big blue Glimpse blocks, and it has a bunch of extensibility points, which are some of which are highlighted in red here. So you can change the way that Glimpse validates, which request that it attaches to and provides information on. You can create your own plugins, which are, at this point, tabs. You can create converters. A converter is used to change the way that Glimpse serializes data, which will also change the way that it is represented, which is part of our Glimpse protocol, this arrow that you see here. I'll talk about this more in a second. As well as change the way that Glimpse stores all of the information that it keeps in between requests. That's the metadata store. So the way that Glimpse kind of ties into ASP.NET is via the use of one HTTP module and one HTTP handler. So the HTTP handler is what you've already seen. That's the glimpse.axdx, and that endpoint supplies the logo, the JavaScript file, all of the icons that you see in our UI. The HTTP module itself is what's keeping track of incoming and outgoing requests from the server, from the application. So that's all very generic ASP.NET stuff. It's part of one ASP.NET, if you will. Below that, we have individual implementations for MVC and web forms that have tabs that are specifically helpful for those development environments. So our metadata store, out of the box, we have an in-memory metadata store. Our converters, out of the box, we don't have very many converters. They're there as an extensibility point for our end users. Our validators, out of the box, we have many. The most common one that you've seen is what you see when you go to glimpse.axd. Let me show you that real quick. These turn on Glimpse and turn off Glimpse. These are actually front-end UI bits for our cookie validator. And what that validator does is only allows Glimpse to appear if a special cookie is attached to the request. So this allows developers, when they're using Glimpse, to turn Glimpse on and off on a request-by-request basis. Other validators will leverage IP addresses, and by default, we only will serve. Glimpse will only work on localhost, either 127.0.0.1 for IPv4 or ::1, which is the loopback address for IPv6. We also have validators that will only allow Glimpse to work when the response is of certain content types. And all of this stuff is completely configurable, and you can create your own validators if you only want Glimpse to work on a subset of your requests. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So what the HTTP module does in Glimpse is it loads up all of our various extensibility points. Let's talk specifically about plugins. And each plugin runs for a given request, gathering the information that you'll see. So the Routes tab, which we've been talking about quite a bit today, gathers all the information about the execution context of a given request's route, and then we serialize it into plain JSON. Although Glimpse uses kind of its own media type, it's just a JSON schema, if you will, that is well known between the client and the server. That JSON schema, represented here by what we call the Glimpse protocol, is sent down to the client, and the client in and of itself has its own extensibility methods. You can attach into an event for pre and post render of the UI, and this will allow you to manipulate or add data on the client side before the UI gets rendered, or post render, which will allow you to change the HTML that Glimpse is creating. So if you wanted to change the way that a specific tab looked, so for example, if you wanted to change config, maybe you wanted to change the colors, that wouldn't be very useful, but or anything else like that, you can hook into post render and change this, because this is just HTML at the end of the day. So let's take a look at what we would need to do to create plugins. Now, plugins, there are many of them, and they're created by both Anthony and I, as well as other members of the ASP.NET community. And we like to think of plugins as coming in plugin packs, and that's the NuGet packages that you saw us installing before. By default, we ship 3 plugin packs: MVC, which we've already looked at extensively today; Web Forms, we haven't looked at so much; as well as EF, which added our SQL tab. So a plugin pack may have many plugins, but of course you can create your own, since it's got its own extensibility point here. So let's hop back into Visual Studio, and I'm going to simply create a very little plugin. So we're going to add a class, and we're going to call this class Modules. The plugin that we're going to create will list out in order all of the HTTP modules that our application is running. And so to create a Glimpse plugin, we have to do a couple of very simple things. The first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to implement iGlimpse plugin, as you see here. And I need to add a reference to that. That comes from the core assembly. And we're going to decorate our plugin with a Glimpse plugin attribute. This decoration provides all of the metadata necessary for Glimpse to automatically discover this class at runtime. We're going to go ahead and implement this interface. And the interface is very simple. So the first is setup. The first method that we're going to worry about is called setup init. We actually won't be leveraging this method moving forward, and it's not even necessary to implement now. So just to prove my point, I'm going to leave an exception throw in there because it's never going to be called. The next thing we're going to look at is this property called name. This is the name of the tab, and this will be rendered out in the Glimpse UI. So I'm going to return the name modules. And finally, we have the meat of the implementation of a plugin, which is this method called getData. We pass in the HTTP context for you to pull information out of that you might have stored earlier in the items dictionary, or to just pull out anything else that you care about from the request. And we have to return back an object. So let's get started by creating the object that we're going to return. I'm going to call that a result. And we're going to make this a list of, let's fix this up, a list from the generic collections of string arrays, because essentially we are going to create a table. So it's a collection of arrays. And inside of that, we're going to put what's going to be our header row. So we're going to do a new array. We don't need that string keyword in there. Open up our curly braces, and we'll do the order, which is going to be an ordinal for the module, the name of the module. And let's also take a look at the module's type. That will help us out with debugging. And so to fill up the order, we're going to keep track of a counter. So we'll set the count equal to 0 to start with. Excuse me. And so now what we want to do is we want to loop over all of the modules, which we can get from the context that's passed into Glimpse. So context dot, we're going to look at the application instance, which has a collection of modules, and we're going to get their keys. And we will just call each one of these instances a key. And so to our result, that list of string arrays, we're going to add a new row. So new string array. Once again, we don't need that string keyword. And inside of there, we're just going to do count. We're going to increment it each time we go around through this list. And we need it to be a string, so we'll toString it real quick here. We will also want the name of the module. That's next. So obviously you can see we're doing the order, which is the count. Name is next, and the name is actually just the key. It gives us a nice friendly name. And then finally we want the type. So we're going to say context.applicationInstance. And then what we want to do is we want to pull out the individual module. So we'll select modules, and we'll use the index syntax to get from the key. And then we want the type name. So we'll get the type of that module, and we'll just pass over the full name. So this isn't necessarily the most pretty code ever, but you can see we're just trying to slap this together to prove the point for how you would actually work with Glimpse. Once we've put together this result, we can just return it. So we'll return our result, and we will compile. We are building and succeeding, and we're going to go ahead and run. We're just running our application. I'm not wiring in this class into our application in any special way, except for the fact that the file is there. And we are loading up our new instance of our application. And you can see here we have a new tab added into Glimpse called Modules, and we can see all of the modules that are running on our application in about 10 seconds of work. You can see the first one that runs is called Output Cache. It is the system.web.caching output cache module, followed by Session, Windows Authentication, Forms Authentication, Passport Authentication. That's interesting. I don't think I will ever be using Passport Authentication. I should remove that. It's probably coming from my machine.config. I would just remove it from my web.config. But you can see I have my role manager, URL authorization, etc., etc. And finally, you'll even see Glimpse is in there. So Glimpse showing how it's actually being implemented. So that is a little bit about the architecture of Glimpse and how you can build a custom plugin. But Glimpse is not just Anthony and I, and it is not just the plugins that we have built. There's plenty of others. So let's take a look at what else is available in the ecosystem.
So essentially, you can see on the right-hand side there, we've listed a few of the third-party plugins that are out there. You can see from this list, there's some that will be fairly useful depending on the type of project you're using, and you can easily find this list of plugins if you go to the NuGet website and do a search for Glimpse. You'll actually see that in there a list of all of these various plugins will come up. Okay, and just the same way that you installed Glimpse via NuGet, you can install any one of these plugins via NuGet. Going back to our PowerPoint slide, you'll see that we couldn't have done this without the help of a lot of people out there. Huge thanks to Stephen, Chris, Matt, Jason, Peter, who particularly helped us get a lot of documentation up and out. Matt, Richard, Adam, and Randy. Again, we couldn't have done it without you guys. And if you're interested in helping, feel free. Please send us an email. We feel as if a lot more is coming, and we're pushing very hard to get the next release out of Glimpse. And once we've got that out, a lot of amazing things will start to flow from there. In terms of links and stuff that you may be interested in, if we go to the next slide, you'll be able to see that we've got a dev list, as well as the Get Glimpse website, as well as our source base. So you go to any one of those. If you're interested in contributing, as we said before, you can reach out to us via email or on the dev list or via Twitter. We're both pretty active. And you can follow the Glimpse blog, or you can come through to GitHub and get a copy of the source code and see what we're actually up to. And besides that, I just thank you for coming along. We really appreciate you taking your time to learn a little bit about Glimpse and taking an interest in how, as a community, we can evolve what's currently a very painful process. And this is kind of the vision that we have. And this is the way that we've been looking at solving it. So if you have any ideas, as we've said, shoot them through. If you have any questions for here and now, please feel free to ask them. And we'll be hanging around for a little bit to answer questions here and in the Jabber room. Thanks again to everyone who made aspConf possible. Eric, Javert, and the rest of the guys. We really do appreciate all your help. And until next time, thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.